Hello there, welcome to this episode 4 of the No Script Web Show, which is all about modern front-end web design. We'll be looking at what we can build today with minimal dependencies and skills. Today we're talking about intrinsic web design, a term coined by Jen Simmons in her 2018 talk, which was called Everything You Know About Web Design Just Changed. She is a graphic designer, educator, and speaker, a member of the CSS working group who worked on CSS grid layouts. She worked as a developer advocate at Mozilla and later at Apple. We'll be adding our perspective to Jen's talks on the history of web layouts and asking what it means for us. I cannot have these conversations by myself, and as always, I'm joined by David Waumsley. How are you doing, David?
Very well. Thank you. Yeah, that was a good introduction.
Thank you. I'm glad that you wrote it for me.
Yeah. Oh, so shall we start? We've got some headers, haven't we?
Yeah.
We've got, and we'll start with what the heck is intrinsic design, which I do remember on the first episode we was doing for this show, I mentioned that and then chucked it at you and said, "Do you have a definition of what it is?"
And the answer was, I really didn't. And to be honest with you, I'm still a little bit hazy on it because there isn't an exact dictionary definition, is there? So
No, of course not. And I think, I get from the talk itself that Jen did is that she's just wanting to signify, whether you use it or not, I think she even says, just wanted to say that I think with the technology we have and the approaches we have to web designing, that it warrants another name other than just a bit more responsive.
right, yeah, responsive plus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I thought there's we've got it actually up on the screen there. There's quite a good quote, I think. Well, it's taken from a tweet from Jeffrey Zeldman, who's paraphrasing Jen Simmons. And I quite like that as my way of understanding intrinsic design as being something different to responsive design.
I'll read it out for the people who are listening to this. So Jeffrey, in his tweet, said, we're programming a flexibility model, not telling elements exactly where to sit and how to look. So it's very much sort of open-ended.
Yeah, and I think that probably with the technology, with the way that we have with CSS Grid particularly, and Flexbox before that, but in a way, when we got Flexbox, we tended to not use it for its flexibility. We tended to set the kind of fixed widths on it. But now all of these kind of ways that the browser can now calculate the size of items and align them for us according to the user that they find, do the calculations for us. I think that's what she's getting over, I think, with this. And that is slightly different from the responsive designs, because when we got that, we just thought it was a reaction with the media queries, I think, to having the iPhone. So we thought, well, okay, we need another version of the phone with the iPhone. We'll use the media queries and then we'll just design something and we will fix where things exactly are going to sit and look, where they're going to sit and look.
Yeah.
Where I think now we're moving away from that. We're now thinking, well, you know what? We'll never know. There's so many different devices out there. Let's stop trying to do that. Let's let the content decide the size that it needs. And I think that's probably the big thing about it.
I think that's quite a hard thing for us to get into our heads as well, because we really have spent a long time, decades on the internet, trying to get things to look exactly as we wish them to look and to know exactly where every pixel will be with any given device. So if you were to open up a tablet and you could tell me the dimensions of it, I would be able to predict exactly where this div or card or content piece would be. But this is a bit different, isn't it? You just sort of generally say, okay, these things will probably be about there, but I'm not entirely sure based upon that device, because everything is entirely, and I'm going to use your word, squishy.
Yes,
Everything can sort of move in its own way, and it will be very hard because the maths is being carried out on the fly as opposed to it being based upon viewports. So at some point it does exactly this. This is a much more fluid. It's doing whatever it says in a kind of curved way. If we move things, if we make the viewport smaller, all of these pieces are going to move over, but we're not entirely sure where they're going to end up. So yeah,
that's a new challenge. And I think it's very different from the way that we've looked when we borrowed from print and we've looked at, generally we thought of templates, we make our boxes and then we put the content into those boxes and we think, oh, okay, that box won't sit there. It'll have to go underneath on the mobile, and we do that. But we still think of it as the same fixed width box, where now suddenly this idea that, well, you're going to say, you want this content to have enough room, but let the browser decide where it is, and you'll style this content. And I think it's just a complete mind flip. And I do think there's something that I thought was quite interesting, because it's 8 years on when Jen did this talk in 2018 from when the big list apart event talk was done. That really brought in the Ethan Marcotte, brought in the responsive era. But he started that off with a quote, which goes back to 2000. I'll read that one because I've got it on my extra notes, which is, we should embrace the fact that the web doesn't have the same constraints as print and designed for this flexibility. But first, we must accept the ebb and flow of things. And I think, in a way, what Jen's doing with this one is having another crack at, if you like, at the same thing that we have to, with better tools now, to be able to do that, to, get us to think about content. And it becomes a HTML first approach, isn't it? You are styling to the HTML document and the content that you put in there, rather than the kind of reverse where we style things and then kind of made the HTML stuff fit into the boxes we designed.
Right. Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. I think it's going to take a whole new generation of people to get into this system. Well, I don't mean a new generation as in it has to be the younger people, because obviously you are absolutely fascinated by this at the moment. But you are really going to have to not unlearn, but just put a completely different layer over what you have already learned, and be willing not to know quite where everything is. But I also think it's quite freeing,
Yeah.
because you can just put something on the page and be satisfied that it'll do something adjacent to what I want, but I won't know exactly where it is. And we've been very much focused on knowing exactly where everything is based upon the device size. And, you only have to look inside the Chrome browser and things like that. And it's obviously got all the different devices by name. And maybe that whole process will change, because it'll just be, drag it in from the left, drag it in from the right, and just see if it's behaving in the way that you'd anticipated. And if not, rewrite the CSS to match exactly what your expectations were. But none of this is new, is it? What did you say? 2018 was when Jen did this talk.
For that talk, yes. And then, 8 years before for responsive, but, alluding to this ebb and flow thing that's been going on for ages, going back to 2000. So it's always been there, this idea, I guess. It's just that the technology, because we can not so much have to set size into absolute pixels, and we have a layout tool that does it. It does open up loads of, I think, creativity. I think that was her main thing, because she's a designer coming at it. And actually, we can kind of talk about that, I guess, while we talk about the main part. A good part of her talk was about the history of web layout. So maybe we can just chat a little bit. For those people watching the YouTube, we have actually borrowed one of her slides to just show her kind of loose history of overlapping changes in the web, going from only having flow only in the beginnings in the 90s, to HTML tables, to Flash, to Fluid, where we would generally write our sites with percentages ourselves, to Fixed, where we ended up getting a lot of these frameworks in. The 960 framework was particularly popular, where we slotted everything into those fixed widths, then moving to responsive, and then to the unknown, which I think is catching on as intrinsic, as an idea that we are perhaps in a new era. So
yeah, it seems to be the watchword of the moment, doesn't it? The word intrinsic design seems to be popping up more and more, which I think is going to be the future for the foreseeable future. However, the chart that we're showing on the page probably does give us some intuition that intrinsic will be here for a period of time and then will be replaced by something in its turn. But for now, it does feel like it's the next evolution. But she also, there was a little quote, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something along the lines of, in evolutionary terms, the internet is that period where the fish grew legs. The fins became a little bit more rigid, and suddenly some of the fish could waddle out onto the land, and all land-based life, which is mobile, came from that moment. And she was likening where we are to that with the internet. And I think that's a really good point. You get the impression that everything we've got now is the destination, but it isn't. We're just literally beginning the journey, and maybe 100 years from now, the internet will still be around, as probably entirely different in the way it's consumed and the kind of devices that are available. But probably look back on where we are now, and it'll just be one of the cards on Jen's chart. Intrinsic design. Oh how quaint
Yeah.
that was.
Well, I mean, she was very much on the mission of the web as opposed to just the internet, keeping that because the core foundations of that is that, HTML, the ability to be able to share information with each other, given to us for free for that and to keep it on board with that. And I don't know what you got from her account of the history, but for me, it was a little bit about, because she frames it within this idea that you've got the designers who want things to just look pretty like hers, and the kind of standards people who just go, we can't lose this thing where it's able to communicate with anybody, whatever the device they've got, whether they can't read or not. We need to keep that HTML markup good. And there's always been this battle of which she thinks is now kind of solved. And I mean, the 2 points, I suppose, in the story was the HTML tables. I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
that,
yeah.
that made stuff pretty, but it ruined the web, didn't it? The
Yeah,
purpose of it.
you
You
can
couldn't.
only
Yeah,
imagine what the HTML markup of a tables-based layout looked like. It would just be a 99% junk that you don't these days need. Yeah.
exactly. And it couldn't work on all devices. It was useless for a good percentage of people who couldn't read the stuff, but it gave you graphics and pretties. And then, of course, from Flash, it almost went entirely off, didn't it? Because then you got proprietary code, which was only effectively embedded in the HTML. It had no relationship to HTML. So it was unusable by basically anybody who wasn't signed up you know, to go in this whole proprietary route. So I think
Yeah.
after that point, I do think then we start to get into the more problems of like, okay, we have agreed that we need to keep the HTML clean and readable and serve everybody. And then the rest of it becomes, well, how do we make the design work? you
That's
know?
right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, if you could stare into the mind of people like Vince Cerf and who's the other guy that's usually
Um,
regarded as one of the founders of the internet? Tim Berners-Lee. That's it.
oh yes.
Tim Berners-Lee. Back in the day when they came up with the idea of hyperlinks and all of that,
Yeah.
just no intuition that the internet would be anything other than an academic exercise that would probably be connected with a handful of computers in major universities, and that was it. And so the idea of moving text around was it. But then it exploded. Suddenly, people had this intuition that it could be used for a thousand different things, and everybody got really excited. Modems came along. We all got computers of one fashion or another. And like you say, HTML tables. Suddenly, people figured out, oh, we can make it
Mm,
look a bit like a magazine. Well, that was
yeah.
not expected, but it had to be crowbarred in. Then obviously everybody realized, well, hang on, we've lost the content somewhere. The actual content is just surrounded by a load of junk HTML that we don't need, but we really like it to look pretty. So who cares? We'll make it
yeah.
look pretty, even though people who can't see it
Yeah.
can't can't consume it. Like you said, Flash was just a little black box. Well, a box that
Yeah.
nothing could communicate with. And now we seem to have gone full circle. And
Yeah.
we're now hopefully at a stage where it can look pretty, but it's just HTML and
And it's look,
CSS.
it's web standards. It's keeping the
Yeah.
web as one. I mean, I think the worry with things like Flash was the break off. You go to this proprietary thing. Suddenly, this free tool for communication that we can all use, which at its core is HTML, if that's lost, which it was really with breaking, HTML with tables and then going off away from it with Flash. And she does make a little thing, and we'll address that later. There's a passing comment. It's not on there. She's not talking about component based design and the move to JavaScript in CSS, or CSS, sorry, in JavaScript. Let's get it
Yep.
right way around.
Yeah.
But she did allude to the fact that that complexity, that it's still always has the potential to produce standards, but it does move it and makes it more complicated and switches the normal route of how the web is built, with JavaScript being an addition to the HTML and CSS. So we'll talk about that later, because it's quite interesting how there has been a shift back, I think, for those people who came in with the JavaScript back to the HTML again. I think so. Even since her talk, I think, but that's for later episodes. I think,
But yeah, just to re-emphasize that point, we really don't know what the destination of this is, but we know that what we're doing at the moment is probably more akin to the spirit. got the standards. It's going to be hopefully consumable by all sorts of different people who
Mm.
can consume things with their eyes or with their ears or whatever it may be. And it does feel like we're going back to something which got lost by things like tables and Flash and all of that.
Yeah, that's why I think we're always with this stuff where everybody seems to be looking backwards to sort of see where we got to where we are now. But I think interesting because her table of sort of dates on it, doesn't reflect my reality in the real world because markets are so much different, aren't they? When something may have gone out of fashion to those people who technically know, like her, who work on the spec, reality is it can become even more popular. So things like Bootstrap and jQuery were still growing up to sort of a year ago and still have a dominance in the market. And, something like Bootstrap doesn't I think it's still experimental when it comes to grid. So,
Wow. Okay.
and grid goes back to 2017. So we're catching up. So you see how things probably are I would say in the real world, things are about 10 years out on her um, kind of history, if you like. But
Yeah, she's very much a thought leader, though, isn't she? And
yes.
I think that's also something which I find remarkable about people like Jen is just
Mhm.
that capacity to stare into a crystal ball and imagine what could be, and then collaborate with other people to build the spec so that that can be, and then communicate with the browser manufacturers so that all of that can be implemented. All of this stuff going on in the background, but
Mm.
just sort of feeling into the future as to what it can be. And then you and I and people like us, we get the trickle down from that. Once it's been
Yeah.
built, we then start to explore we can do with it. So it really does make people like her seem, almost messianic because they can build the future and imagine what that would look like, and have the passion to push their agenda and their vision through.
Yeah, I mean, it's people like, there's always somebody, I think, in the working groups on a spec at the time. So we got her, and then we got Rachel Andrew, who we talked about last week. And we'll be talking sooner about Miriam Suzanne, who effectively is the same sort of role in the working groups when it comes to container queries. And the thing is, I'm so thankful that we got people like that who can kind of relate it, that they built websites and they can relate what's going on the technical side of the W3C into stuff that we might understand how we might put it to use. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder what and again, I'm going off piste a little bit here, but I wonder what the incentive for them is. So obviously they've got the time to do it, so they must have some sort of job. So in Jen's case, I think you said worked at Mozilla for a long time and perhaps is at Apple now, although that I don't know if that's still the
mhm,
case. So these companies, maybe there's a philanthropic element to it. So we're talking about standards based, and it'll be able to be viewed by everybody. But maybe also it's just good commercial sense. If Google's Chrome browser, which seems to be really the browser of choice for almost any part of the world that you care to go into, if all of these things are built in, it makes whatever they build more likely to succeed as well. And if we can convert everything over to the web and rely less on, I don't know, proprietary software sitting on a desktop computer, it can all be handled online. That works for them as well, I
yeah,
suppose. So that kind of philanthropic versus company discussion is quite interesting.
yeah. Should we just move on a little bit
Yeah.
to? Well, we put a little section here, just some questions for ourselves on what does this mean for us, and I kind of put the answers in here as well, which was, well, we do. I do feel there is a bit of re-education that's needed going on. I mean, we covered it a little bit last time in the sense that we were referring to the fact that Rachel Andrews says it's often easier to teach somebody who doesn't know CSS today because we kind of have to think about it in a very different way because suddenly an outpouring of a load of changes have come to it. And a new mental model, the intrinsic mental model, I think means that we have to kind of re-educate ourselves. So not everybody can, set up a podcast, but that's our way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, and but there is a lot to. I don't know if unlearn is the right word, but there's a lot.
Uh,
Like I said earlier, there's another layer just to slap on top. But
yeah,
a lot of the layer which is slapped on top means that the layers beneath, there's bits of that no longer are worth thinking about anymore. And it's kind of figuring out which bits of the new knowledge which bits replace the bits that I used to know, and I think that's going to be the journey that I'm on, because I'm very much at the beginning of all this, and I've got a lot of re-educating to do. And for me, it's quite hard because I am constantly thinking, yeah, but I could do that with something that, and then you figure out, oh no, but then it wouldn't enable this possibility. Wait a minute. So there is quite a lot of re-education, and I think I'm sure you're right. If you're a person just going into college or just beginning on your web development journey, I think you've probably got a shot at doing far more learning than I will do, because mine is going to be bundled up with forgetting what I've already learned.
Yes. Um, I mean, we put down, I put down setting better expectations of the web for clients. And what I mean is, I think what this is trying to do is get us a little bit back to that we are putting out content in HTML and the styling goes over the top of that. Where I think for most clients, their expectation is, and their experience is a pretty site, which they see in their one particular view and say that I like something like that,
Yeah,
because that's their experience. They probably won't understand unless said otherwise that, the importance of good HTML in terms of helping them to get visitors because it's, search friendly, and um, being able to reach many more people and designing over the top of that. So I often think there's a lot of trying to not only cope with the fact that we're almost flipping the way you design upside down, but also I think, if you have to do it for somebody else, they usually come in with an expectation of show me a website and I'll tell you if that's what I like the look of, but there's so much more to it than that, isn't there?
yeah, yeah. How much of this do you think you're going to be pushing forwards into your client's lap? Or, I mean, are you going to be talking about any of this? Will the word intrinsic design ever exit your mouth when you're talking to clients? Or is it more about, okay, look, I'll show you roughly what it'll look like when we use a different variety of browsers. Are you even going to get into that? Are you just going to, I mean, I think the word responsive design has landed so well out in the real world that I think even non-technical people understand that, there's something going on when you look at it on a mobile that's different to a desktop. But do you feel that you need to educate your clients with the
I, um,
technicalities of this?
well, as I've learned, I think I've started talking about it differently. I do talk about it as in terms of the content that we need, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how it's styled to a lot of people. I mean, if that content isn't reaching everybody who might want it and that search engines, etc., can't see it. So we always start with the content and then we say how we're going to beautify that content from
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
And I think that's it. And because of that approach to it, it makes a lot more sense to them. So usually the first conversation is about how how their message is going to go and reach people.
So the content comes first, the design is a definite
Yeah.
second,
So,
right?
so I,
Okay.
th- I think it's easy to explain to them in that way. If it had no design, it would still do quite well. As many badly designed sites, if they've got the fundamentals underneath, can do quite well.
Well,
I,
it's
I,
interesting though, because that's kind of a profound shift for a lot of people, isn't it? Because really, the building of websites, it very much felt like the design was central to what the
yeah.
client wanted. It's like, well, okay, how's it going to look? And you fill it up with lorem, and
Yeah.
then you pull the lorem out, and hope for the best. Whereas this is exactly the opposite. Let's just start with the content. Let's get the message right, get the words right, get all the assets right, and then right,
Well, do you know what? I mean, that's it. Though. So the next point is probably changing how we organize web projects. And
right,
she alludes to that in the talk, doesn't she? Was saying the typical thing is that someone has an idea, then they get a rough draft of that idea, better draft of that idea, and then it goes to the person to turn that into the code. And that really is the way it's always been done. But in a way, it's the wrong way round because, there is something to know about how that's code. The intrinsic bit, I wouldn't use it with clients, but I think the intrinsic is saying that it's still intrinsic to that web standards, HTML, means of communication. The design is a part of the content. And that's in a way, while she's doing all her clever experiments, which she does, which we put links to on the show notes there to her layout land where she does experiments. She's coming in from the I want it pretty and the designer, but knows from a standards perspective, she needs to have this good, clear, well marked up communication in the HTML. But I think what she's seen is, oh, I can have lots more fun with this. And I think that's the way I'm trying to sell it now on to clients without using Intrinsic, because it doesn't mean it's just, it sounds like tech talk, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But
It's interesting because it feels like the workflow of a
yeah,
project is amended. So,
yeah,
rather than the design coming first or at the same time as the content, the content comes first, the design then comes second, but it doesn't marginalize the importance of the design. It just,
yeah,
and it's not like designers are going to go out of work. In
exactly.
fact, they're going to have a lot more, a lot more to think about, but it just puts it in a different position in the
Yes.
project workflow. It comes after the content, whereas I feel very often it was the other way around. Yeah.
Yes, and exactly, because you can't control the devices that people are coming in on their experience. And of course, something that Jen talks about and lots of other things. I'm not sure in that talk, but otherwise, she's very keen to point out that, whatever design you do, if somebody sticks it in reader mode, or they decide they have
Yeah.
high contrast on
Yeah.
their computer, or they're on the screen readers, all that, all of what you've designed isn't there. So the essentials, we all must agree, is that everybody can get this content, and that's a well marked up HTML. But I think what she's making as a designer is like, wow, there's so much clever stuff. And actually, it's a harder task for the designer now, because you can't fix them into these boxes any longer. There's come in different devices. So now you have to be really inventive and imagine lots of different flows for your content. So people will got lots of different experiences, all of which will be great from a designer. So I think the designer is more important now, but I just think the traditional approach of the designer, where they would just create something that looked pretty with just their colors, and that's your box where you got to stick that text in there, and this is where you're going to stick this widget, and that approach to it doesn't work. The
It'll be
templating, I don't think.
it'll be quite interesting because in the past, you had so many conversations with designers where you would get the design and then you would figure out that the content wouldn't fit in the design.
Mm.
Now it's entirely possible that that conversation will go in reverse, and you'll give them the content, and the designers will say, "There's too much content. We can't get the content into anything like a reasonable design." So there'll be interesting trade off. Your menu, it's lovely, but there's 97 items in it. We can't
Yeah.
deal with that. You've put everything front and center. So there's just have to figure out new ways to have these conversations and new workflows to make it
I
work.
think I think Nathan, you put on your tab, just for those on YouTube, I think
I
you
did.
put that her labs, where she's got lots of little experiments. I mean, these are a bit out of date because there's so much more you can do. But I mean, if you make that responsive, I think you should
Yeah.
just
So for those that are listening to this, we're showing, and
yeah.
I'll give you the URL. It's labs.jensimmons.com. I'm sure David will put that into the show notes. But what we're staring at is a like a desktop-ish layout, but everything
Mhm.
is on its side. And as I reduce it, you can see that essentially lots of the different pieces. It now looks like it's in two halves, where the top half is moving up and the bottom half appears to be moving down a little bit. Then suddenly, everything that was at 45 degrees at some point went to normal orientation.
Yeah.
And as we can see, I mean, it just so smart. So it dramatically changes the way it looks
Yeah.
based upon the design. And if you're watching the video, you'll be able to get an impression of that. But yeah, go to labs.jensimmons.com and just play with the width and the viewport, and it's so clever. I love
Yeah.
it.
And it changes, doesn't it? I think, that idea that you might go, oh, I've had an idea, and everybody, because what we've always tried to do with all our designs is, when we've said, okay, the visual design is what we want, and we want everyone to experience it, we've been trying to bang these kind of square pegs into round holes with it, trying to make the code underneath work. And but that's it. I mean, it's that kind of thing, which I think is just clever design I can't do, because, okay, there isn't one experience for people, but you can't force an experience that's going to be brilliant. But what you can do now is you can create a range of experiences.
Right, right, and it looked every even if you do a tiny modification to the width of the window that you're looking at it in. So I'm just going to move it by what I consider to be a centimeter on my screen. I know that unit is of no use to anybody, but you get the idea. It's changed. You can't predict where it's going to go. I mean,
Yeah.
you can roughly predict where it's going to go, but and there we go, little tiny change again, and another one, and then there's suddenly a dramatic change.
Yeah.
and then another dramatic change about now, and then we go back out, little change. It's just, you're right. I mean, I wouldn't have the
Yeah.
faintest idea what she's done here, but
And she
it's
could put
beautiful.
all the text on an angle because the space is there big, but it
Yeah,
wouldn't work small. So
yeah,
I think it's a great time for design. Sometimes when you talk about the web standards, which I'm very keen on getting the HTML right, it sounds like you're poo-pooing it. And I think that's what Jen's talk does for us. Comes in with a designer's perspective where you go, yeah, sure, it needs to be good. Everybody needs to be able to access the content you make for the web. That's just a given, isn't it? But then you can still be beautiful with stuff. You just have to think a little bit differently, I think. You have to work from the content rather than the design, and then stick the content in it. You make the content flexible and interesting, so it only needs it doesn't have more space than it needs, but it
yeah,
has the
yeah.
space
I'm
it
with you,
needs.
and
Yeah,
I think it's going to be interesting for people who create these websites, especially if their role is the content. Let's say is encapsulating that to sort of hand it off to a designer to suggest what that design could look like. Yeah, I think it's a whole new set of skills that we're going to have to get new conversations to get into, new ways of
yeah.
figuring it out, new workflows. But ultimately, I think we'll manage it.
Yeah, okay. I think it translates to. I think any client or the type of client I work with, when it's just a solo owner, it's easy to get over the fact you want to get your message out there. The easiest way is to make sure you get good HTML that Google can read for all of that stuff, and then we can have some real adventures about how this content's going to design, which gets us back to the let's start with the content.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a great system, I think. So yeah, different from what we've done, I think, in the past.
We should probably plug Jen Simmons' YouTube channel as well. She's got
Yes.
a channel called Layout Land. I imagine you'll be able to Google that, but if you can't, it will be in the show notes. And
Yeah.
it's video after video after video of her showing all sorts of interesting things that you can do. I haven't consumed even a tenth of what she's done, but it's all really fascinating and breaks apart one little problem at a time, and
Yeah,
it's lovely.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
brilliant.
mean, the only problem with it is that some of the stuff has moved on. You might do some
That's
of this
true.
stuff differently, but it's
Yeah.
still, I think it's a useful. She's good at talking as well. So
Yeah. Yeah, she is. Yeah, she's very good. How do you feel? Have we managed to get through that
I
episode
think we
or
have.
okay.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we have. Shall I just lead on quickly because it does lead on from her talk a bit into the next one. Got two episodes which we'll do next, which will really be talking about component based design, which you didn't talk about. And at the time of our talk in 2018, we didn't have container queries, and I think that's component based design can come out of that. But we've also got something called web components. So I think next time, I think we'll talk about component based design because when you're looking at Jen Simmons, this is really somebody who's making a document uh, look beautiful, basically. It's kind of how we started with the web, and that's all she sort of refers to. But there is this sort of other movement, isn't there, where actually, the web is just these little blocks of UI that we build up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think next time that's just a little lead in. It sort of comes out of her talk because in some way she makes reference to it, but doesn't cover it.
Okay, so component-based design, container queries, all that kind of stuff coming up in episode
And
5. We're taking it each episode is just recorded when it's recorded. Um,
yeah,
we'll get them out as we get them out. So it may be that we manage one every week, or maybe it'll fall into a shorter cadence or longer cadence. Who knows? But for now, I guess we've wrapped up number 4.
yeah,
And we'll see you on the No Script show next time. For those of you that are listening, the website is being updated with the bits and pieces that we've talked about, and you can find it at noscript.show. And then you just do / and the number of the episode. So this will be noscript.show /4. And
brilliant.
yeah, there we go. I will see you next time, David.
Yeah, lovely. Bye bye.
Bye.